The first attempt to house and restrain those considered to be mentally ill in Western Australia was in the hull of a ship, the Marquess of Anglesey, that had been grounded at Arthur Head in Fremantle. The first patient was the ship's surgeon of the Rockingham, who had gone insane on the long voyage for England. Scott's Warehouse was the next location to be used, but this was clearly unsuitable and was described at the time as fetid. Designed by Richard Roach Jewell, the Fremantle Lunatic Asylum was constructed by convict labour from 1861 to 1865. The building was designed to house 32 lunatics, but when opened, it admitted 45, although one source states that number could have been as high as 58. Overcrowding was to be a feature of the institution throughout its existence. Sadly for those who were incarcerated, the definition of lunacy was very broad and included conditions that have no relation to mental illness, such as epilepsy, postnatal depression, and even just having a rebellious nature. Inmates were referred to as prisoners. Their heads were shaved and they were given second-hand prison clothing to wear. Cases were recorded of uncooperative wives being admitted by their husbands, employees who walked away from their jobs being committed by their employers. In fact, women who showed any sign of independence could find themselves locked away on a whim. Males had equally harsh treatment when it came to being admitted. Being a vagrant, or considered to be a burden on society, or even being a little slow, was enough. You could be put away when no one could see you, and polite society didn't have to spare a single thought for your future. These unfortunates were not even separated from those who were truly insane and violent. The asylum was expanded in the decade between 1886 and 1896, but there was never enough funding and no will to make the conditions any better for those incarcerated within its walls. The story goes that Bunning brothers, Robert and Arthur, half-jokingly submitted a tender for the expansion work while waiting for a ship to depart. The tender was accepted, and they stayed in WA and went on to found the Bunnings empire that we know today. Additions to the building were designed by George Temple Poole and were constructed in the 1880s and 1890s. There were isolation cells that were used to subdue violent, intractable patients, but they were also used to punish others for fairly minor infractions. Staff were not properly trained in the care of mentally ill people, and although nurses had some medical knowledge, there was no real compassion. There were accusations of patients being beaten with sticks and deprived of food, stuck with pins, and even of sleep deprivation. Ill treatment, dreadful conditions, and complete apathy by the authorities and government meant that the patients were condemned to a living hell. Bedbugs, fleas, and unsanitary conditions all added to the misery experienced by patients. The harsh, grim interior included no areas for recreation, and no respite for the more normal patients from the wailing of those who were indeed totally insane. In the 1890s, it wasn't just adults being condemned to this facility. Increasing numbers of children aged between 9 and 15 were incarcerated. Some were to live out their lives in asylums, starting at Fremantle and then being transferred to Claremont when the Fremantle institution closed in 1909. The length of time people stayed in the asylum varied considerably, depending on their perceived usefulness to society. Those considered capable of work spent on average 6 years. Others thought to be lost causes spent 12 to 30 years, and some their entire remaining lives after they were committed. It's probably little wonder that in more modern times there have been many reports of restless spirits, a feeling of hopelessness in different areas of the building. People report emotions ranging from despair to rage and overwhelming sadness. Chilling encounters have led some visitors to run screaming from the building, refusing to return, and others have been seen struggling with some unseen force. The most famous inmate of the asylum was Moondyne Joe, or more properly, Joseph Belitho Johns. Joe spent his last days in the asylum, where he died in 1900. Official inquiries made into the horrific conditions at the asylum all came to nothing, until one headed by Frederick Vosper in 1900. The inquiry found that the asylum was completely unfit for purpose, and that a new asylum urgently needed to be built. Sadly, although this inquiry was to instigate change, it was to be 9 long years before the asylum closed and the inmates were moved to a new facility. The asylum closing was not the end of the misery this building was associated with, because as the asylum closed, a women's home opened. This was not the protective style of institution that we would associate with that name today, but a rather primitive place that was once more used to hide away those people that society no longer wanted to see. Widowed and abandoned women, single mothers, and any woman unable to care for herself could be dumped at the home and left there indefinitely. Part of the building was used as a midwife's training school, and at least women admitted there could expect a level of medical care and a matron who showed compassion. Again, lack of funding and staff shortages plagued the place. The men's home in Dalkeith was much better funded and was the sole beneficiary of a large bequest. Any woman unfortunate enough to contract venereal disease could expect to be locked up in the home and kept away from society, to whom they posed a threat. These troublesome women were housed in the old asylum building from 1910 to 1942. With the Second World War, the asylum became accommodation for members of the US Navy. This was not good news for the women who had been living there. They were bundled off to a dilapidated Woodbridge house in Guildford. 70 women were now expected to live in a building that had previously only housed 21. The old asylum buildings were first fumigated and then renovated, and Supply Base 137 began operating. When the war ended, the asylum was abandoned. The seeming end of its existence was punctuated by a fire and an explosion resulting from the ammunition left behind by the departing Yanks. Parts of the building were used for a time as a school, while John Curtin's School was being constructed. By 1956, the buildings were left to the cockroaches and ghosts. In 1958, it was decided to demolish the place, but at the last minute, a group headed by George Seddon and Fremantle Mayor Fred Sampson fought to save the old buildings. The chairman of the National Trust in Britain said of the building, "Don't you let them demolish this building. It's the most marvellous example of colonial Gothic architecture in Australia." In the end, the asylum building was saved, although it took quite some time. The building opened to the public as a museum in 1970. In 1973, the Arts Centre began to operate, and the rest, as they say, is history.